Good evening, everyone. It's Ken Kim, and this is part three in my three-part series on a recap of the 2024 election. So I went over the Maryland Senate race pretty in-depth, briefly, and now I want to talk about some of the other Senate races. So heading into 2024, we actually had four Democrat incumbents in right-leaning states, not even just swing states. A bunch of these were safe red states that actually won during the Bush era, where they first won in 2006. They won again in 2012 and then 2018, and they all went down in 2024. And that was in West Virginia, Joe Manchin; Ohio, Sherrod Brown; Montana, John Tester; and Pennsylvania, Bob Casey. And that was the one that shocked me. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over in detail why it was, that is how they were able to win three times, but then they kind of went down in 2024, which I kind of expected some of them to go down. So let's first start off with West Virginia. So West Virginia has actually historically been a blue state, believe it or not. This state actually voted for Carter over Reagan, and it voted for Bill Clinton twice. It wasn't until the 2000s that Republicans finally started gaining traction with West Virginia, and Bush actually won it, as you can see here in this chart, by a little over 10 percentage points. And so on the left here, you see that this is the Bush map for West Virginia, that he started winning over some of these ancestral white working class Democrats that were very dependent on the coal industry. And it was actually during the Trump era that West Virginia started going super Republican. As you can see on the right here, this is what the West Virginia map looks like under the Trump years. It has gone over 40 points more Republican than Democrat, which is actually very unusual for West Virginia. So it does leave me and intrigue me to see like how West Virginia will vote once Trump is off the top of the ticket, as West Virginia was a very extreme example of how well Trump did with the blue dog Democrat working class base, in the sense that he essentially turned a state that a few decades ago was leaning Democrat, and now he pretty much made it a safe Republican state. And so when Manchin was winning West Virginia, Republicans were only winning by a little over a 10-point margin. But then when Trump came into the equation, essentially it was going to be very difficult to have that type of crossover where he'd have to have that many more split ticket voters in the partisan area that we are in right now era. And so now I'm going to go over Montana. Montana, very similar situation. John Tester, when I did the math, he needed about like 50,000 people to split the ticket from 2018 or 2020 uh, in 2024 for him to get the crossover. But however, the thing that doesn't help with Montana is a state that's starting to have some growth. And you see Montana actually in 2008, Obama actually almost flipped the state. Believe it or not, Montana had consecutive Democrat governors, and it is one of the states, a rarity, that does split ticket vote. And Montana is a state that's not as red as people like to remember it, in the sense that Montana, they are a more pro-choice. It's a very college-educated state, a demographic that's been shifting away from the GOP. And prior presidential candidates, they've won Montana, but they've, again, same kind of similar situation where they're only winning by like 10 points. Under the Trump years, Montana has gone over 20 points more Republican than Democrat. And you saw that here in 2020, which is a blue wave year. Montana went almost 38 points more Republican than Democrat, which is pretty insane to think about, how that's usually not the norm. And you saw how these rural areas just got a lot redder under the Trump years on the right, versus on the left. This is more of like the pre-Trump era, like the 2008-2012 map. And the next one I want to talk about is Ohio, because a lot of polling actually had Sherrod Brown winning re-election, and Sherrod Brown is someone that did a very good job of getting a lot of crossover vote support. However, I knew that Sherrod Brown was probably going to go down just because he was going up against a GOP candidate that was winning by a much bigger margin than prior Republicans in the past. So when Sherrod Brown won in 2006, he actually defeated the current Republican governor, Mike DeWine, by 13 points. And so that's a very good indicator of like how electable Sherrod Brown is in the state of Ohio. And there's a reason why him, just like John Tester in Montana and Joe Manchin in West Virginia, there's a reason why they won 3 elections in a row. So when Bush was winning Ohio, he was only winning Ohio by 2 to 3 percentage points in his respective elections, while the GOP actually lost Ohio in 2008 and 2012. However, when Trump era started, Trump was winning Ohio by over 8 percentage points both times heading into 2024. So the reality of the situation was I actually had him winning Ohio by close to 10 because it voted almost close to 10 the prior 2 elections. In 2020 was more of a blue wave year, where this year was going to be more of a red leaning year. So then Ohio, like many Midwestern states, only got more favorable for Trump as the cities like Cleveland and other cities like Detroit in the Midwest were losing population, while Trump was energizing a lot of rural turnout. And so, despite what polls had, Trump was able to carry Moreno over the finish line. So, on the left, you see is the traditional Ohio map before the Trump era and the after the Trump era. You see like a lot more deep red counties, and you even see some shifts even in the suburbs of areas like Cleveland, for example. So I knew that Sherrod Brown was going to have a difficult time because he was not in a scenario where he would be able to get the normal split ticket voting. He would have had to get a few 100,000 more people to split ticket than before, and in that type of partisan lean, it was going to be difficult for sure. So this is the one that shocked me actually was the state of Pennsylvania. So to give a little background, Bob Casey was the Democrat incumbent, and Bob Casey's dad was a very popular governor in the state of Pennsylvania. And Casey actually defeated Rick Santorum, who's considered one of the more electable Republicans in the state of Pennsylvania by almost 20 points in his first run in 2006. And Pennsylvania, like Wisconsin and Michigan, was a state that had not voted Republican since the 1980s until the Trump era. So Pennsylvania as a whole should not have been viewed as a super purple state after Trump flipped in 2016, because in 2016 there were still a million more registered Democrats than Republicans, and Democrats did turn out more. And Casey being the son of a popular governor, it was going to be very difficult because he has very good experience of getting that split ticket crossover vote. To be honest, when I did my projection for Pennsylvania, I thought Casey was going to hold on. I didn't think he was going to win by the margins that he normally wins it by, but I thought he was going to hold on within like 1 to 3 percentage points just because he never had to go up against a candidate that was actually winning Pennsylvania as a GOP candidate. And so on the left here, you see that Pennsylvania, this is the normal GOP map for Pennsylvania, where the GOP is doing okay in the city. Well, I shouldn't say okay, but they're doing a little bit better on like some of the more white suburbs, but they're doing worse in the rural areas. But then on the right, you see that Trump is winning Erie. He flipped it, but then he's also flipping a lot of other counties around in some of these rural areas. But then also too, a lot of the rural areas are getting substantially more redder. So the fact of the matter is, having Trump at the top of the ticket was a very big help for Pennsylvania, for David McCormick to finally unseat Bob Casey. And you look at the Senate states where the GOP lost: Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona. Michigan and Wisconsin, these are almost flips with the GOP. Wisconsin had an incumbent Tammy Baldwin, who actually also, I believe, had won 3 terms as well. And Michigan was an open seat. And to be honest with you, the GOP, I'm kind of surprised they didn't spend as much money as they did in these 2 seats, just because with Trump at the top of the ticket, he was going to be able to carry over a certain amount of votes over to the category. And so I think that if the GOP had spent a little bit more money in these 2 races, I think this would have been flippable. Even Nevada, surprisingly, another incumbent, um, Sam Brown did not do anywhere near as bad as I thought, only losing by less than 2 percentage points. And then Arizona was the worst Senate seat performance out of any of the GOP candidates. And to be honest, I was of the opinion if the GOP had gone a different candidate besides Kerry Lake, they possibly could have flipped the Senate seat. However, I will hold my opinions on this, and there's a reason why. So when we look at Arizona, as we can see here, Trump obviously won the state. He had ironically, his best performance in Arizona compared to the other 7 swing states, as opposed to on the Senate level. The Senate seat for Arizona was actually the worst performance of the 7 swing states, ironically. And you see here that Trump obviously was able to flip Maricopa back into his Commonwealth. Carol Lake came up short of Maricopa. And also, too, the thing that was kind of surprising to me is Lake actually still got more votes than Harris, which I was a little surprised about. And the thing that kind of intrigued me about this race in particular is because there was actually a good amount of crossover of Trump Gallego voters. And the reason why this kind of intrigues me is because of the fact that Gallego didn't run that moderate of a campaign, in the sense that he actually ran a more of a progressive liberal campaign. And it kind of reminded me of how in the Bronx you had people that are splitting their ticket for Trump and AOC on the same ballot. And that's usually an indicator that it's not necessarily a Republican leaning voter. It's more or less maybe like a left wing populist Democrat that just thought Kamala Harris was just too establishment or whatever the reason may be. And so instead of voting for her, they actually voted for Trump. And that did happen here. But then also to Gallego having a lot of split ticket voting with Trump. So, and I look at the map. So on the map on the left is a map for U.S. Senate for 2024, and the map on the right is the map for 20 for the presidential. And as you can see here, when you look at the map closely, so on the top right, you have Cosino and Apache counties, and Trump did substantially better than Lake. But looking at the demographic, these counties have an abnormally high Native American population that have actually started to vote more in recent times. Native Americans still vote more Democrat than Republican. For example, Apache is almost 71% Native American, which is very unusual for a county to have that high of a density. But then also to Trump did better in the border counties. Santa Cruz County, which is the southernmost blue county on this map, is over 80% Hispanic. And this county actually has not voted Republican since 1988. Trump actually had the best performance in this county by getting over 40% for a Republican. And so part of me, you look at the changes in Arizona, has me to believe that I think a good percentage of these people that did vote for Trump and Gallego, they're not necessarily the white McCain Republicans that voted before and then just came back home. I mean, I do think there was some of that going on. However, I can't visualize a scenario where someone that's a white McCain style Republican, they held their nose for Trump and then they vote for someone like AOC. And that's kind of what happened with Trump Gallego here. And so you look at this map, a good percentage of these voters that vote Trump Gallego were Native Americans and Hispanics that probably do lean Democrat. Because again, a little background about Arizona, there was some animosity towards the Hispanic and Native American communities towards the GOP because they had office for a few decades now, just because they felt like their votes were being suppressed because of the English literacy requirements to vote. So they did call that voter suppression. So I wouldn't be surprised if even today a lot of people in those communities have this type of feeling towards the GOP. And for sure, this is definitely not the state of Barry Goldwater anymore. I mean, Barry Goldwater, who was considered Mr. Arizona during the 60s, would absolutely struggle like hell with this current map of Arizona right now. And the reason why I bring up Barry Goldwater is because Barry Goldwater, when he was winning pretty comfortably in Arizona, he was very anti Voting Rights Act, civil rights during the 60s, and he had a very condescending tone towards African Americans. And he's actually part of the reason why a lot of African Americans actually left the GOP for good. And then Nixon, when he ran after Goldwater, tried to recreate the black voting bloc for the GOP and try to rebuild that relationship. But then when Reagan ran a very similar conservative campaign to Barry Goldwater, it pretty much left the GOP in the dust with getting single digits again with African Americans. But yes, so then now that I've gone over the different Senate races, I want to go over partisanship actually, just because again, as I look at more and more of these recent elections, I'm just reminded of how partisan elections are today. And in the left, I have the 1988 election versus the 2008 election. And there's a reason why I'm doing this comparison, because there's a lot of similarities in the sense that George H.W. Bush and Barack Obama, in this 20-year span, they both got around 53% of the popular vote, whereas Michael Dukakis and John McCain, they got the exact same percentage, 45.7% of the popular vote. And on top of that, turnout was actually higher under Barack Obama than it was under George H.W. Bush. And so you would think in that scenario that Obama definitely would have gotten a lot more electoral college votes because turnout percentage as a whole was higher, but then he was getting the same exact percentage as H.W. Bush. However, Obama actually got 12 less states than Bush. And that's part of the fact that our elections have gotten very, very partisan in the sense that we have not had a presidential candidate win by double digits for the popular vote in the last 4 decades now, which is very unusual because in the past, presidential candidates used to win by double digits for the popular vote all the time. So this is the longest streak we've gone on without having a unanimous decision for the president. And that's just because of the fact that during 1988, a lot more states were considered swing states compared to now, like where you have 20 plus states that vote only Republican, and then 20-ish states that vote only Democrat consistently for like the last 5, 6 election cycles. And then I want to talk about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. This was actually proposed first when Bush won the 2000 election, despite losing the popular vote. Pretty much, to break it down simply, the winner of the popular vote wins the state, regardless. In the green and yellow were in the green states. So these are states that want to join the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, and the ones in the yellow were the ones that were considering it. However, if this law had gone into effect, Trump would have actually gone 520 electoral votes. Most states pushing for this were blue states. And I think a lot of people in the Democratic Party weren't expecting Trump to win the popular vote or other Republicans to win the popular vote. And so this is what the election would have looked like if that had gone into effect. Pretty much the only states that Trump would have lost was New Hampshire and Virginia at that point. And then I just wanted to go over again. I actually went over this graph in a similar video, or well, not similar video, but a video about Georgia where I talked about how the different demographics voted. Trump did make some gains with blacks, Hispanics, and Asian Americans. However, his black gains were just a few percentage points, and relative to like the history of other presidential candidates. And then with split ticket voting, this thing I think is interesting and just shows how polarized we're getting. During Reagan's presidency, Republicans never had control of Congress, and at times Democrats actually gained House seats. While near the end of Reagan's second term, Democrats were able to get 55 Senate seats because of split ticket voting becoming more common. And however, as we saw in 2024, there were a lot more people voting straight ticket, and that's part of the reason why Trump in 2016 and 2024 was able to get the Senate and the House, because it was becoming less common. The type of voters that usually split ticket are more likely to be minority voters like Hispanics and Asians versus whites. And some examples of people that are splitting their ticket, these are some more extreme examples. I looked at LA, Kentucky, where the longest Democratic voting streak in history voted 144 years for the Democratic presidential candidate, and that actually flipped for Donald Trump because of his appeal to white working class trends. And out of the 50 states, Trump actually had some of his best performances in Kentucky, voting for Trump by over 30% almost all 3 times. But despite this, they elected a Democratic governor, Andy Beshear, in 2019 and 2023. But then you look at how he campaigned in 2023. He wasn't campaigning on his opponent being tied to Trump. He actually campaigned on his opponent having the stance on abortion. And so even though Kentucky is a Republican leading state, it is a reminder that some of these red states are not necessarily conservative on some of these social issues. And then also too, you had Arizona where you had the Geico Trump voter, Bronx, New York, you had the AOC Trump voter, and even Georgia you did have people that voted for Trump, but that did vote for Stacey Abrams for governor. And I think it's kind of interesting just because of the fact, like, you do have these minorities that necessarily are probably not fans of some of the old guard GOP candidates because they talk nice, and also too is just the fact that some of these minority groups may necessarily be coming from communist socialist countries, so they may be a lot more supportive of populism as a result. And the opposite of that would be someone that is very okay with communism. And I have seen that those type of immigrants as well in the U.S. And talking to some of these people that are supportive of communism is the fact, like, some of the arguments they try to make is the fact where people that live under communism are in safer countries just because of the fact that the government's constantly watching for crime. But then also too, they try to make the argument that children are more disciplined in these countries. They also try to make the argument about child slave labor is incentivized with capitalism. However, the problem with that argument in particular is communist countries are very guilty of using child slave labor as well. And that's just a whole rabbit hole, but it does give a very interesting perspective that not all these immigrants are pro capitalism, vice versa. And so it's kind of interesting to see like what type of ticket splitting we might see in the future as America gets a lot more diverse. And I actually made like a theoretical projection on how the GOP may do if they had gone with a different candidate. For example, Nikki Haley, I thought she was a good example of like a good oligarch style Republican. To be honest, I think she would have a very good time of winning back some of the Sun Belt states a lot easier than Trump. However, the thing I think Nikki Haley would struggle profusely with is I don't think Haley would get the real turnout like Trump did in the Rust Belt and possibly even lose Ohio just because of like the percentage, the turnout machine in those states versus like what Trump on the ballot. However, I did have her winning New Hampshire, but even then, with this map, Haley would have came short against Biden because in this regard, if Haley was a nominee or DeSantis was a nominee, I think Biden would have stayed in the race. I think the fact that Trump potentially winning back the White House is part of the reason why Biden dropped out. And to be honest, DeSantis, maybe he would have won Ohio, but even then, though, I don't see him winning New Hampshire. And to be honest, Haley in the best case scenario, I had her winning Virginia, but I think DeSantis would have a hard time winning Virginia just because of his more conservative viewpoints, and I don't think he would get the numbers in the Nova area to carry Virginia. And to be honest, part of the reason why some of the old GOP candidates would really struggle in the sense that if they're not winning in the Rust Belt, it's going to be much more difficult for them to try to win back some of the old swing states, like say like Colorado, New Mexico, that Bush went after. But yeah, that is my presentation. Thank you all for watching. Hope you guys learned something. Bye.